of the Hydaspes was Porus, who was seen to have with him a large number of elephants. Because all fords were held by pickets and elephants, Alexander realized that his horses could neither be swum nor rafted across the river, because they would not face the trumpeting of the elephants and would become frantic when in the water or on their rafts. He resorted to a series of feints. While small parties were dispatched to reconnoiter all possible crossing places, he divided his army into columns, which he marched up and down the river as if he sought a place of crossing. Then, when shortly before the summer solstice the rains set in and the river became swollen, he had corn conveyed from all quarters to his camp, so that Porus might believe that he had resolved to remain where he was until the dry weather. In the meantime, he reconnoitered the river with his ships and ordered tent skins to be stuffed with hay and converted into rafts. Yet, as Arrian writes, all the time he was waiting in ambush to see whether by rapidity of movement he could not steal a passage anywhere without being observed. At length, and we may be certain after a close personal reconnaissance, Alexander resolved to make the attempt at the headland and island described by Arrian, and in preparation he decided on a maneuver almost identical with that adopted by General Wolfe in his 1759 Quebec campaign. Under cover of night, he sent out his cavalry to various points along the western bank of the river with orders to make a clamor, and from time to time to raise the battle cry. For several nights, Porus marched his elephants up and down the eastern bank to block an attempted crossing until he got tired of it, kept his elephants in camp, and posted scouts along the eastern bank. Then, when Alexander had brought it about that the mind of Porus no longer entertained any fear of his nocturnal attempts, he devised the following stratagem. Upstream and along the western bank, he posted a chain of sentries, each post in sight and hearing of the next one, with orders to raise a din and keep their picket fires burning while visible preparations were made at the camp to effect a crossing. When Porus had been lulled into a sense of false security, and all preparations were completed at the camp and the crossing place, Alexander set out secretly and kept at some distance from the western bank of the river, so that his march would not be observed. From the Wiles of War, 36 Military Strategies from Ancient China. To cross the sea without heaven's knowledge, one had to move openly over the sea but act as if one did not intend to cross it. Each military maneuver has two aspects, the superficial move and the underlying purpose. By concealing both, one can take the enemy completely by surprise. If it is highly unlikely that the enemy can be kept ignorant of one's actions, one can sometimes play tricks right under its nose. From the I Ching. Chaos, where brilliant dreams are born. By Su Dong. One who studies ancient tactics and employs the army in accord with their methods is no different than someone who glues up the tuning stops and yet tries to play a zither. I have never heard of anyone being successful. The acumen of strategists lies in penetrating the subtle amid unfolding change and discerning the concordant and contrary. Now, whenever mobilizing, you must first employ spies to investigate whether the enemy's commanding general is talented or not. If instead of implementing tactics, he merely relies on courage to employ the army, you can resort to ancient methods to conquer him. However, if the commanding general excels in employing ancient tactics, you should use tactics that contradict the ancient methods to defeat him. From The Theory of the Avant-Garde, by Renato Poggioli. The chief characteristic of fashion is to impose and suddenly to accept as new rule or norm what was, until a minute before, an exception or whim, then to abandon it again after it has become a commonplace, everybody's thing. Fashion's task, in brief, is to maintain a continual process of standardization. putting a rarity or novelty into general and universal use, then passing on to another rarity or novelty when the first has ceased to be such. Only modern art, because it expresses the avant-garde as its own extreme or supreme moment, or simply because it is the child of the romantic aesthetic of originality and novelty, can consider as the typical, and perhaps sole, form of the ugly what we might call ci-devant beauty, the beauty of the Ancien Regime, ex-beauty. Classical art, through the method of imitation and the practice of repetition, tends toward the ideal of renewing in the sense of integration and perfection. But for the modern art in general, and for avant-garde in particular, the only irremediable and absolute aesthetic error is the traditional artistic creation, an art that imitates and repeats itself. From the anxious modern longing for what Rémy de Gourmand chose to call, suggestively, le beau inédit, derives that sleepless and fevered experimentation, which is one of the most characteristic manifestations of the avant-garde. Its assiduous labor is an eternal web of Penelope, with the weave of its forms remade every day and unmade every night. Perhaps Ezra Pound intended to suggest both the necessity and the difficulty of such an undertaking when he once defined the beauty of art as a brief gasp between one cliché and another. The connection between the avant-garde and fashion is therefore evident. Fashion, too, is a Penelope's web. Fashion, too, passes through the phase of novelty and strangeness, surprise and scandal, before abandoning the new forms when they become cliché, kitsch, stereotype. Hence the profound truth of Baudelaire's paradox, which gives to genius the task of creating stereotypes. And from that follows, by the principle of contradiction inherent in the obsessive cult of genius in modern culture, that the avant-garde is condemned to conquer, through the influence of fashion, that very popularity it once disdained. And this is the beginning of its end. In fact, this is the inevitable, inexorable destiny of each movement, to rise up against the newly outstripped fashion of an old avant-garde, and to die when a new fashion, movement, or avant-garde appears. By Marcel Duchamp. I have forced myself to contradict myself in order to avoid conforming to my own taste. And lastly, from Warriors, Warfare and the Native American Indian, by Norman Bancroft Hunt. A similar vision among the Siouan tribes turns the warrior into a heoka, who also exhibits the clown-like behavior of the Wendigokan, the use of sacking as a war shirt and plastering the body with mud. Psychologically, the heoka was of immense importance, as were similar characters among numerous other tribes. During periods of happiness and plenty, he saw only gloom and despair, and could be goaded into providing hours of harmless amusement when he gorged himself on buffalo ribs while complaining there was no food in the camp, or declared he was dirty and proceeded to wash in a bath of mud. Yet, behind this benign face of the heoka, there lurked the